The morning sun cast long shadows across the abandoned playground where Kaylin Ashworth once taught children about the wonders of nature. Now, 3 weeks after the outbreak began, those same swings creaked eerily in the wind, their chains bearing rust stains that looked disturbingly like dried blood. Kaylin crouched behind the brick wall of Roosevelt Elementary, his weathered hands gripping a crowbar with white knuckles as he watched the figures shambling through the schoolyard. They had been his neighbors once. Mrs. Henderson from down the street moved with the same slow gait she'd had in life, except now her Sunday dress hung in tatters and her face bore the gray pallor of death. Behind her, the mailman who had always waved cheerfully each morning now dragged his left leg at an impossible angle, dark fluid seeping from wounds that would never heal. The transformation had happened so quickly that most people couldn't comprehend it. One day, reports of a strange illness in major cities dominated the news cycles. The next, those same cities had gone dark, communication cut, and refugees fleeing spoke of the dead rising to devour the living. Kaylin had initially dismissed such claims as mass hysteria until he witnessed his own principal, Dr. Martinez, tear out the throat of the school nurse with teeth that had somehow become unnaturally sharp. A soft whimper behind him made Kaylin turn. Vesper Nightingale, barely 8 years old, clutched a stuffed rabbit that had seen better days. Her parents had died in the first wave, and somehow she had found her way to him during the initial chaos. Dark curls framed her dirt-smudged face, and her blue eyes held a wisdom no child should possess. "Are they still out there, Mr. Kaylin?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the distant moans that had become the soundtrack of their new reality. "Yes, little star," he replied, using the nickname he'd given her. "But we're safe here for now." The lie came easily, though they both knew nowhere was truly safe anymore. The creatures that had once been human possessed an insatiable hunger and an inexplicable ability to sense the living. They moved in hordes, drawn by sound and movement, and their numbers seemed to grow with each passing day. Kaylin had spent the previous evening fortifying their hiding spot in the school's basement. Storage rooms filled with old textbooks and broken desks had become their sanctuary. He had barricaded the windows with furniture and found alternative routes through the building's ventilation system. His background as a former Marine, a detail he rarely shared with his teaching colleagues, had proven invaluable in these desperate times. The sound of breaking glass echoed from somewhere within the building, followed by the distinct shuffle of feet on linoleum. Kaylin's blood ran cold as he realized their sanctuary had been discovered. He gathered Vesper in his arms, pressing his finger to her lips in the universal signal for silence, and began moving toward the emergency exit he had scouted days earlier. As they crept through the darkened hallways, past bulletin boards still decorated with children's artwork about spring flowers and Easter bunnies, Kaylin couldn't help but think about the world that had been lost. The mundane beauty of parent-teacher conferences, the joy of watching a struggling student finally grasp a difficult concept, the simple pleasure of sharing lunch with colleagues in the faculty room, all of it had vanished as surely as if it had never existed. The emergency exit led to an alley behind the school, where Kaylin had hidden a backpack containing their few precious supplies, water purification tablets, canned food, a first aid kit, and the solar-powered radio that had become their only connection to the outside world. Static mostly filled the airwaves now, but occasionally they caught fragments of broadcasts from other survivors, desperate voices calling out coordinates or warnings about infected zones. As they emerged into the afternoon sunlight, Vesper pointed toward the horizon where thick black smoke rose from what had once been downtown. The acrid smell of burning buildings mixed with something far more nauseating that Kaylin tried not to identify. In the distance, a helicopter circled like a mechanical vulture, though whether it carried rescue or reconnaissance remained unclear. "Where are we going now?" Vesper asked, her small hand finding his with the trust that only children could maintain in the face of absolute horror. Kaylin looked down at her upturned face and felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders like a lead blanket. He had heard rumors of a safe zone being established to the north, though such stories often prove to be cruel mirages in this new desert of despair. Still, movement meant hope, and hope was all they had left. "North," he said simply, shouldering the backpack. "We're going to find other people, other survivors. You're not going to be alone anymore, I promise." As they began walking away from the only home Vesper had ever known, neither of them looked back at the school where the dead now wandered the halls where laughter had once echoed. Dr. Zara Whitmore had delivered hundreds of babies during her career, but she had never imagined that one day she would be using her medical skills to determine which bite marks were fatal and which might still allow for amputation. The makeshift clinic she had established in the abandoned gas station offered little in terms of sterile conditions, but it provided something more valuable than cleanliness: hope for those who still drew breath. Thorne Blackwater, a grease-stained mechanic with forearms like tree trunks, had arrived at her station 3 days earlier carrying his unconscious daughter. The teenager, Indira, bore fresh scratches along her left arm where she had fought off an attacker. The wounds were clean, showing no signs of the telltale blackening that preceded the transformation, but Zara had learned to be cautious about celebrating too early. "She's been unconscious for 2 days, Thorne said, his voice cracking with exhaustion and worry. Dark circles under his eyes suggested he hadn't slept since finding her. "She won't wake up, but she's breathing." "That's good, right? That means she's not turning?" Zara checked Indira's pulse for the 10th time that morning. Strong and steady, which was indeed encouraging. The girl's bronze skin showed no signs of the mottled gray that marked the infected, and her body temperature remained normal. Still, they all knew too little about the infection's progression to make any guarantees. "Her body is fighting," Zara said carefully, adjusting the makeshift 4-drip she had fashioned from salvaged materials. "Sometimes trauma sends people into protective unconsciousness. We need to give her time." The gas station had become an unlikely refuge for the small group of survivors who had found each other through a combination of luck and desperation. Lysander Grimm, a retired history professor whose wild white beard and intense green eyes made him look like a prophet from ancient times, had proven invaluable in understanding the strategic aspects of survival. His knowledge of siege warfare and historical pandemics provided insights that none of them would have considered. The Romans faced similar challenges during the plague of Cyprian, Lysander explained to anyone who would listen, his educated accent cutting through the harsh reality of their situation. Isolation, resource management, and maintaining social cohesion became more important than military might. "We must think of ourselves not as refugees, but as the founders of a new civilization." Caius Redfield, a former army sergeant whose jaw bore the scar of some long-ago conflict, appreciated the old man's strategic thinking but remained focused on more immediate concerns. He had spent the morning reinforcing their perimeter defenses and calculating ammunition reserves with the methodical precision that had kept him alive through 2 tours of duty. "Philosophy is fine," Caius said, checking the action on his rifle for the 3rd time that hour, "but those things out there don't care about Roman history. They care about fresh meat, and right now, that's us." The dynamic between the survivors fascinated Zara from a psychological perspective. Each person had fallen into roles that reflected both their backgrounds and their methods of coping with trauma. Lysander intellectualized the crisis, Caius prepared for battle, Thorne focused entirely on his daughter's welfare, and she herself had thrown herself into the medical challenges with an intensity that bordered on obsession. The radio crackled with another transmission, drawing everyone's attention. A woman's voice, distorted by static and distance, repeated coordinates followed by the word "sanctuary" before cutting out entirely. They had heard similar broadcasts over the past week, but most led to empty buildings or worse, traps set by those who had decided that survival justified any cruelty. 40 miles northeast, Caius said, studying the map they had salvaged from the station's convenience store. "That puts it somewhere in the National Forest area. Could be legitimate. Could be a death trap," Thorne countered, never taking his eyes off Indira's pale face. "I'm not moving her until she wakes up. I won't risk losing her because we got impatient." Zara understood his position entirely. The girl had become their unofficial symbol of hope, the possibility that the next generation might survive this catastrophe. Her unconscious state served as a daily reminder of how fragile their situation remained, but also of how much they had to protect. As if summoned by their conversation about her, Indira's eyelids fluttered. Zara immediately moved to her side, checking pupil response with a small flashlight. The girl's brown eyes opened slowly, confusion evident as she tried to process her surroundings. "Dad," she whispered, her voice hoarse from disuse. Thorn's relief was so overwhelming that he nearly collapsed. "I'm here, baby girl. You're safe. You're going to be okay. Where are we? What happened to the school?" Indira struggled to sit up, and Zara helped support her weight. There were so many of them. Mrs. Peterson, she wasn't Mrs. Peterson anymore. The memory brought fresh tears, and Zara felt her own eyes sting in sympathy. Every survivor carried similar images, the moment when someone they trusted had become something monstrous. The psychological trauma would outlast any physical wounds, assuming they lived long enough for therapy to matter again. "You fought them off," Thorn said, pride mixing with sorrow in his voice. "You survived, and that's what matters now." Indira looked around the gas station, taking in the fortified windows and the arsenal of improvised weapons. How many others made it? The question hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Each of them could have answered with specific numbers, but the mathematics of loss had become too painful for casual conversation. Instead, they focused on the present, 5 adults and 1 teenager, alive against impossible odds, bound together by shared trauma and mutual dependence. Outside, the wind carried the sound of distant moaning, a reminder that their world had fundamentally changed and that every moment of peace came at the cost of constant vigilance. The meeting between the two groups happened by accident, as most meaningful encounters did in the aftermath of civilization's collapse. Kalen and Vesper had been following a stream northward when they spotted smoke rising from what appeared to be a controlled fire rather than another urban conflagration. The distinction mattered greatly in their new reality, where cooking fires suggested human intelligence and warmth meant potential allies or dangerous enemies. They approached the gas station with the caution of prey animals, observing from a distance as armed figures moved with purpose rather than the aimless wandering of the infected. Vesper clutched her stuffed rabbit tighter, her young mind still processing the concept that other people could be just as dangerous as the creatures they fled. "They're organizing supplies," Kalen whispered, noting how one person maintained a watch position while others worked. "Military training, maybe. Could be good or very bad for us." The decision to reveal themselves came when Vesper spotted another child through the gas station's windows. Indira sat propped against a wall, clearly recovering from some ordeal, but undeniably alive and human. The sight broke through Vesper's carefully maintained composure, and before Kalen could stop her, she was running toward the building with the desperate hope of finding others her age. Caius had his rifle raised before the little girl covered half the distance, his training demanding that he treat any unexpected movement as a potential threat. But Lysander placed a gentle hand on the weapon's barrel, his elderly wisdom recognizing the desperation in a child's sprint toward perceived safety. "She's just a little girl," the professor said quietly. "And she's not alone." Kalen emerged from the tree-line with his hands raised, the universal gesture of peaceful intent. His weathered face and careful movement suggested military background, but the way he called out to Vesper revealed something more fundamental, a protector's instinct that transcended training. "Easy, little star," he called. "Let's meet our new friends properly." The next several hours passed in the delicate dance of survivors evaluating each other's trustworthiness. Stories were shared in careful increments, each person revealing enough to establish credibility without exposing potentially dangerous vulnerabilities. Zara examined both newcomers for signs of infection, while Thorn grilled Kalen about his knowledge of local geography and potential safe routes. Vesper, meanwhile, had attached herself to Indira with the intensity of someone who had thought she might never see another young person again. The teenager, still weak from her ordeal, nevertheless welcomed the company of someone who hadn't yet lost the ability to find wonder in small things. They sat together examining Vesper's collection of items salvaged from their journey, a marble that caught light like a captured rainbow, a pressed flower from their former school, and a photograph of her parents that she carried like a talisman. "My mom used to read to me every night," Vesper said, tracing the edges of the photograph with one small finger. "She had this voice that made everything seem safe, even when the storms got really bad." Indira felt tears threatening and swallowed them down. "My dad reads to me too. Different books now, though. Survival guides and medical texts mostly." She glanced toward Thorn, who was deep in conversation with Challeng about potential routes north. "He's scared, but he pretends he isn't for my sake." The observation revealed an emotional intelligence that impressed Lysander, who had been listening to their conversation while organizing their combined supplies. Children, he reflected, often perceive truth more clearly than adults who had learned to construct elaborate deceptions to protect themselves from harsh realities. As evening approached, the expanded group faced their first major decision together. The radio had picked up another transmission, this one much clearer and more detailed. A voice claiming to represent a military outpost described a secure facility 43 miles to the northeast, complete with medical facilities, reliable food sources, and defensive positions that had successfully repelled multiple attacks. "Could be legitimate," Caius said, studying the coordinates on their increasingly precious map. "The location makes tactical sense: high ground, limited approach routes, close to water sources." "Could also be bait," Thorn countered, his natural skepticism sharpened by parenthood. "We've heard promises before. Most of them led to empty buildings or worse." Zara found herself considering the medical implications. "If it's real, they'll have proper equipment, pharmaceuticals, maybe even research facilities working on understanding the infection. If it's fake, we're walking into a trap with limited ammunition and 2 children to protect." The debate continued well into the night, with each person weighing survival odds against the psychological need for hope. Lysander provided historical context about similar dilemmas faced by displaced populations throughout history, while Challeng shared his military assessment of their current defensive positions' limitations. Ultimately, it was Vesper who provided the deciding voice. "My mom always said that standing still was just another way of giving up," she announced with the startling clarity that children sometimes possessed. "Maybe the place on the radio isn't real, but we know this place won't keep us safe forever." Her words carried the weight of innocence confronting harsh truth, and the adults found themselves unable to argue against the simple logic of movement representing hope. They would leave at first light, traveling in formation with overlapping fields of observation and predetermined fallback positions. As they settled into their sleeping arrangements, sharing watch duties and organizing their equipment for travel, each person contemplated the bonds that were forming between them. Survival had forced them together, but something deeper was emerging, a sense of chosen family that transcended blood relations or shared history. Vesper fell asleep curled against Indira's side, her stuffed rabbit serving as a bridge between childhood comfort and adult responsibility. Thorn and Challeng discovered a mutual understanding born of protective instincts, while Zara and Lysander found intellectual companionship in their shared analysis of their situation's complexities. Outside their fortified windows, the moaning of the infected provided a constant reminder of what awaited any mistake or moment of carelessness. But inside their improvised sanctuary, 7 people had become something more valuable than individual survivors. They had become hope incarnate, proof that humanity's capacity for connection could survive even the end of the world. The abandoned highway stretched before them like a scar across the landscape, its asphalt surface cracked and stained with evidence of humanity's final exodus. Rusted vehicles sat scattered at odd angles, their doors hanging open like broken wings, each one telling a story of desperate flight that had ended in tragedy. Challeng led their small convoy with the methodical pace of someone who understood that rushing toward salvation could lead to destruction. 3 days had passed since they left the gas station, and the journey had already tested every bond they had formed. Vesper had developed a cough that worried Zara, though the doctor kept her concerns private to avoid spreading panic. Lysander's age showed more clearly with each mile, his breathing becoming labored despite his determination to keep pace. The group had already faced 2 encounters with roaming infected, managing to avoid detection through careful timing and collective discipline. It was Indira who first spotted the trapped family. The overturned minivan lay half-hidden by an overpass, its wheels still spinning slowly in the afternoon wind. Smoke rose from the engine compartment, and through the spider-webbed windshield, they could see movement inside. Human movement, accompanied by voices calling for help with increasing desperation. 3 adults, possibly children, Caius reported, studying the scene through binoculars. Vehicle stable for now, but that smoke suggests an engine fire. They've got maybe 30 minutes before it becomes dangerous. What's the infected situation? Challeng asked, though he was already scanning for the telltale shambling figures that seemed to appear wherever human voices carried. None visible, but that won't last long. The noise they're making will draw attention soon. The tactical assessment was clear: rescue was possible but would require exposing their group to significant risk. They had limited medical supplies, barely enough food for themselves, and any delay could mean missing their window to reach the rumored sanctuary before their own resources ran out. "We have to help them," Vesper said with the absolute moral certainty that only children possessed. "That could be us trapped in there." Thorn studied his daughter's face, seeing her struggle with the same ethical dilemma that haunted every survivor. Help others and risk everything, or preserve resources for those already committed to your protection. Baby girl, sometimes we can't save everyone. Then when does it stop? Indira's question cut through their tactical discussion like a blade. When do we become the kind of people who walk away from families trapped in burning cars? Lysander stroked his beard thoughtfully, recognizing the philosophical crisis that defined their new reality. Throughout history, survival has required impossible choices. The question isn't whether we can save everyone, it's whether we can save anyone while remaining human ourselves. Zara was already preparing her medical kit, having made her decision through the simple calculation of professional oath versus personal safety. If we're going to do this, we do it fast and we do it smart. Caius, how long to extract them? 10 minutes if the doors aren't jammed. 15 if we need to cut metal. But we'll be completely exposed the entire time. The plan came together with the efficiency of people who had learned to make life-or-death decisions in seconds rather than hours. Caius and Challeng would approach the vehicle from opposite sides, with Thorn providing cover fire from an elevated position. Zara would assess casualties and determine who could travel immediately. Lysander would watch the road with Vesper and Indira, ready to signal the approach of any threats. The family inside the minivan proved to be parents with twin boys, perhaps 6 years old, and an elderly woman who appeared to be the children's grandmother. The father had sustained a broken arm in the crash, while one of the boys showed signs of concussion. All were dehydrated and terrified, but miraculously free from infection. "We've been driving for 4 days," the mother explained as Zara splinted her husband's arm with practiced efficiency. "We heard about a safe zone on the radio. Military protection, medical facilities, real food." Challeng exchanged glances with Caius, recognizing the same coordinates they were pursuing. The confirmation that others had received similar transmissions provided either validation or evidence of a sophisticated trap designed to collect survivors in one location. The extraction proceeded smoothly until Vesper's sharp eyes spotted movement on the horizon. A group of infected, perhaps 20 strong, shambled toward them with the relentless determination that characterized their kind. The sound of the rescue operation had indeed drawn attention, and now they faced the nightmare scenario of protecting 11 people instead of 7. "Move, move, move!" Caius barked, abandoning stealth for speed as the situation deteriorated rapidly. The elderly grandmother proved unable to walk at the required pace, her arthritic joints protesting every step. Lysander, despite his own physical limitations, immediately offered his shoulder for support, while Thorn swept one of the twin boys into his arms. The group moved with desperate efficiency, but the infected were closing distance with mathematical certainty. It was Challeng who made the sacrifice that saved them all. As the fastest of the infected broke away from the main group, he turned to face them with the crowbar that had become his signature weapon. "Get them to the ridge line," he called to Caius. "I'll buy you time." "Challeng, no." Vesper's scream cut through the tactical necessity like a physical blow. "You promised you wouldn't leave me." The confrontation lasted less than 3 minutes, but each second stretched into eternity for those watching from safety. Challeng fought with the skill of a trained soldier and the desperation of a man protecting his chosen family. He fell 3 of the creatures before their numbers overwhelmed him, disappearing beneath a mass of grasping hands and snapping teeth. Zara had to physically restrain Vesper from running back toward the feeding frenzy, holding the sobbing child against her chest while her own tears fell freely. The man who had become their unofficial leader, who had saved them repeatedly through wisdom and sacrifice, was gone with the brutal finality that defined their new reality. The expanded group continued toward the coordinates in stunned silence, each person processing grief while maintaining the vigilance necessary for survival. Vesper carried Challeng's backpack like a sacred relic, while the rescued family began to understand the true cost of their salvation. As evening fell, they established camp in an abandoned church, its stained glass windows casting colored shadows that seemed inappropriate for their somber mood. The twins played quietly with Vesper's marble, their innocent presence a reminder that life continued even in the face of devastating loss. "He saved all of us," the rescued father said quietly, cradling his splinted arm. "I need to know his name." "Challeng Ashworth," Lysander replied with the reverence reserved for the heroic dead. "He was a teacher before all this. Said his job was to help children find their way in the world." Outside the church, wind carried the distant sounds of the infected still searching for prey they would never find. Inside, 11 survivors held vigil for a man whose sacrifice had redefined their understanding of what it meant to choose family in the aftermath of civilization's collapse. The national forest welcomed them with the deceptive tranquility of nature reclaiming human spaces. Pine needles carpeted the abandoned access road, muffling their footsteps as they approached the coordinates that had drawn them across 43 miles of devastated landscape. Vesper walked in silence, clutching Challeng's compass like a talisman, her young mind still processing the reality that the man who had promised to protect her was never coming back. Dr. Zara Whitmore had assumed unofficial leadership after Challeng's sacrifice, though she felt woefully unprepared for the psychological aspects of guiding traumatized survivors. Her medical training helped her recognize the signs of complicated grief in their expanded group, but treating emotional wounds required resources she simply didn't possess. The rescued family, Marcus and Elena Corvetti with their twin boys Dante and Lucian, plus Elena's mother Rosa, looked to her for guidance with the desperate hope of people who had already lost everything once. "The radio signal is stronger here," Caius reported, adjusting the frequency as static cleared to reveal distinct voices. Military communications, medical updates, and what sounded like civilian coordination suggested genuine organized activity rather than elaborate deception. Whatever's broadcasting, it's sophisticated and ongoing. Lysander studied the topographical features with scholarly interest, noting how the terrain provided natural defensive advantages while maintaining access to water sources and potential evacuation routes. "If I were establishing a sanctuary, this location would be ideal. High ground, limited approaches, and sufficient space for expansion." The twins, Dante and Lucian, had attached themselves to Indira with the instinctive trust that children showed toward slightly older children who still remembered how to play. They spoke in the abbreviated language of siblings, finishing each other's sentences and communicating through glances that excluded adults entirely. Their resilience amazed Zara, who had seen too many cases where trauma shattered young minds beyond repair. "Are there going to be other kids there?" Dante asked Indira, his 6-year-old logic focused on the social aspects of survival rather than tactical considerations. "I hope so," she replied honestly. "But even if there aren't, we'll take care of each other. That's what families do." The word family carried different weight now that Challeng was gone. Their group had redefined itself around his absence, with each member taking on responsibilities that honored his memory while acknowledging their changed dynamic. Thorn had become more protective of all the children, not just Indira, while Vesper displayed a maturity that broke Zara's heart even as it inspired admiration. They crested a ridge as the afternoon sun began its descent toward the horizon, and the sight below them justified every mile of desperate travel. The sanctuary was real, a collection of repurposed buildings surrounded by defensive walls that showed evidence of professional military engineering. Guard towers provided overlapping fields of observation, while gardens and livestock pens suggested successful efforts toward self-sufficiency. Jesus, Marcus whispered, his broken arm forgotten in the face of visible civilization. It's actually real. Smoke rose from cooking fires rather than burning buildings, and the figures moving through the compound walked with purpose rather than the shambling gait of the infected. Solar panels gleamed on rooftops, and the distant sound of a generator suggested electrical power, luxuries that had become mythical during their weeks of survival. Rosa, the grandmother who had survived the journey despite her physical limitations, began weeping with relief. Mijos, we made it. We actually made it. The approach to the sanctuary required careful navigation of obvious defensive measures. Trenches disguised with natural vegetation, motion sensors mounted on trees, and carefully positioned obstacles forced visitors into predetermined routes that could be observed and controlled from the guard towers. It was Caius who recognized the professional competence of the defenses and called out the proper military identification phrases he hoped would prevent them from being shot as potential threats. 11 survivors requesting sanctuary, he called toward the nearest guard tower. We've traveled from the southern townships, following radio coordinates. The response came through speakers they couldn't see, a woman's voice professional but not unfriendly. Maintain your current position. A medical team will approach for standard screening procedures. Do not advance beyond the yellow markers or you will be fired upon. The screening process lasted 2 hours and tested every aspect of their physical and mental condition. Blood samples, temperature checks, and neurological assessments designed to detect infection were followed by psychological evaluations that probed for signs of hostile intent or advanced trauma symptoms. The twins endured the procedures with the patience of children who had learned that cooperation meant survival, while Rosa required assistance due to her age and exhaustion. Dr. Sarah Chen, the sanctuary's chief medical officer, reminded Zara of herself before the outbreak, competent, organized, and still operating under the assumption that systematic approaches could solve most problems. You've done remarkable work keeping everyone healthy under field conditions, she told Zara during the evaluation process. We could use someone with your practical experience. The sanctuary housed nearly 200 survivors, ranging from families with children to elderly individuals who had somehow managed to reach safety despite overwhelming odds. The community had established routines that maintained both security and humanity, school sessions for children, work details for adults, and evening gatherings that preserved social connections despite the horror that surrounded their isolated pocket of civilization. Vesper's first night in a real bed proved too overwhelming after weeks of sleeping on the ground or in abandoned buildings. She ended up curled on the floor beside the bunk she had been assigned, her stuffed rabbit serving as anchor to memories of the man who had died protecting her chosen family. Zara found her there during a late-night medical check, noting how even sleep couldn't erase the lines of loss from the child's face. He's still with you, you know, she said softly, adjusting a blanket around Vesper's small form. Every lesson he taught you, every moment he made you feel safe, that's his gift that no one can take away. I miss him, Vesper whispered without opening her eyes. I miss him so much it feels like my chest is broken. That's how love works, Zara replied, thinking of the patients she had lost and the family members who had died before she could reach them. The pain means the connection was real, and real connections don't disappear just because someone isn't physically present anymore. Outside their temporary housing, guard patrols maintained vigilant watch against the infected hordes that pressed constantly against the sanctuary's defenses. But inside the walls, 11 survivors who had become family through shared loss and mutual sacrifice began the slow process of healing while honoring the memory of the man whose final act had made their salvation possible, the sanctuary's morning bell echoed across the compound with the false normalcy of civilization preserved through constant vigilance. 3 weeks had passed since their arrival, and the rescued group had begun to integrate into the community's carefully structured routines. Vesper attended classes with other children, learning mathematics and reading alongside wilderness survival and basic medical skills. The twins had discovered playground equipment that still functioned, their laughter providing counterpoint to the distant moaning that served as perpetual reminder of the world beyond the walls. But paradise in the apocalypse came with costs that civilian refugees rarely understood until crisis forced harsh realities into the open. Dr. Zara Whitmore worked alongside Dr. Sarah Chen in the medical facility, their combined expertise treating everything from infected bite wounds to psychological trauma. The sanctuary's research laboratory represented the closest thing to hope for a cure that anyone had encountered, but the work required resources that grew scarcer with each passing day. "We're losing ground," Dr. Chen admitted during their weekly supply assessment. "Antibiotics, pain medication, even basic surgical supplies are running critically low. And the infected are adapting." The adaptation was the most terrifying development yet observed. Recent attacks on the perimeter had shown evidence of tactical thinking among the infected, coordinated approaches, use of tools, and problem-solving abilities that suggested the transformation preserved some cognitive function while redirecting all intelligence toward the acquisition of living prey. Lysander had documented these behavioral changes with scholarly precision, his historical perspective providing context for what they were witnessing. "Evolutionary pressure," he explained to anyone who would listen. "The virus is selecting for infected individuals who are more successful at hunting. We're not just fighting mindless creatures anymore, we're facing predators that learn from their failures." The immediate crisis came when the sanctuary's scouts reported a massive horde approaching from the southeast. Thousands of infected, moving with unprecedented coordination toward their location. The defensive walls that had protected them for months would be insufficient against such numbers, and evacuation protocols designed for small groups became meaningless when facing a migration of the dead. "How long before they reach us?" Commander Patricia Hayes asked during the emergency council meeting. Her military bearing provided stability in crisis, but even she looked shaken by the scale of the approaching threat. 48 hours, maybe less, Caius reported, his reconnaissance training evident in the precise assessment. "They're not wandering randomly. Something is drawing them here specifically." The answer came from an unexpected source. One of the sanctuary's research scientists, Dr. James Morrison, revealed that their experiments had included broadcasting low-frequency signals designed to study infected sensory responses. The unintended consequence was that these transmissions had acted like a beacon, drawing infected from hundreds of miles away. "We can stop the broadcasts," Dr. Morrison insisted, his face pale with the realization of what his research had caused. "Maybe redirect them away from the sanctuary." "Too late for that," Commander Hayes replied grimly. "They're already locked onto our location. We need to focus on survival options." The debates that followed revealed fundamental divisions within the sanctuary community. Some argued for immediate evacuation, abandoning their carefully constructed haven in favor of dispersed survival groups. Others insisted on fortifying their position and fighting for the civilization they had built. A third faction proposed the most controversial option, using the research laboratory to develop a biological weapon that could eliminate the infected entirely. "We're talking about genocide on a species level," Dr. Chen argued against the biological weapon proposal. "Yes, they're no longer human in any meaningful sense, but the ethical implications." "Ethics are luxuries for people who aren't facing extinction," interrupted Dr. Morrison, his scientific pragmatism overriding humanitarian concerns. "We have 48 hours to develop a solution, or everyone in this sanctuary dies. Including the children." The mention of children crystallized the debate in ways that abstract ethical discussions could not. Vesper, the twins, Indira, and dozens of other young survivors represented humanity's future, assuming anyone survived long enough for futures to matter. Their protection justified measures that would have been unthinkable before the outbreak. Thorn found himself torn between his protective instincts and his moral compass. If we release something that kills all the infected, what guarantee do we have that it won't kill us too? Or that it won't spread beyond our control and eliminate whatever human settlements might still exist? None, Dr. Morrison admitted. But doing nothing guarantees our destruction. At least this way, we're making a choice instead of simply accepting defeat. The vote was scheduled for that evening, but events accelerated beyond their carefully planned timeline. The infected horde had been traveling faster than projected, and forward scouts reported contact within 18 hours rather than the expected 48. The sanctuary's defenders prepared for battle while scientists worked frantically to complete their biological weapon research. Vesper approached Zara as medical preparations reached fever pitch. "Dr. Zara, are we going to have to leave again? Are we going to lose another home?" The question cut through all strategic considerations to reach the emotional core of their situation. These children had already lost everything multiple times, had watched protectors die and sanctuaries fall. The idea of forcing them to flee again felt like a betrayal of every sacrifice that had brought them this far. "I don't know, little star," Zara answered honestly, using Kalen's nickname for the girl who had become the emotional heart of their extended family. "But whatever happens, we're going to face it together. That's what families do." Outside the medical facility, work details reinforced barricades and distributed ammunition while scientists debated the ethics of survival in a world where traditional morality had become a luxury that might cost them everything. The sanctuary had given them 3 weeks of peace, but paradise in the apocalypse was always temporary, and the price of its preservation might be their humanity itself. As darkness fell, the distant sounds of approaching doom grew steadily louder, and the most difficult decisions in human history awaited the dawn. The first infected reached the outer perimeter at dawn, their shambling forms silhouetted against the sunrise like harbingers of humanity's final chapter. Dr. Zara Whitmore stood at the medical facility's reinforced windows, watching as thousands of creatures that had once been people pressed against defenses that seemed suddenly fragile despite months of careful construction. The biological weapon had been completed during the night, its creation representing both scientific triumph and moral catastrophe. Dr. Morrison and his team had developed an aerosol compound that would theoretically eliminate all infected within a 30-mile radius, but the long-term consequences remained unknown. The vote had been close, 67 in favor, 53 opposed, with dozens abstaining rather than choose between survival and ethical purity. "Deployment in 30 minutes, Commander Hayes announced over the compound's intercom system. All personnel to designated shelter positions. Sealed breathing apparatus mandatory." Vesper sat in the children's bunker, her stuffed rabbit worn nearly threadbare from months of constant companionship. Around her, dozens of young survivors waited with the patience that trauma had taught them, their faces reflecting resignation rather than fear. They had learned that adults made decisions beyond their control, and that survival often required accepting outcomes they couldn't understand. Indira held the twins close, their small bodies trembling despite her attempts to project calm confidence. "Remember the story Mr. Kalen used to tell," she whispered to distract them from the sounds of battle above. "About the brave knight who protected the village from the dragon?" "But the knight died," Dante said with the brutal honesty that children possessed. "The dragon killed him even though he was good." "That's not how the story ends," Vesper interrupted, her young voice carrying unexpected authority. "The knight died, but his bravery made the village stronger. And when other dragons came, the people remembered what he taught them about being brave." Thorn monitored radio communications from his position in the command bunker, tracking the deployment of their ultimate weapon with the sick fascination of someone watching civilization's final gamble. The aerosol spread with deadly efficiency, creating an expanding circle of death that eliminated infected and vegetation alike. "It's working," Dr. Morrison reported, his voice mixing triumph with horror as surveillance cameras showed thousands of infected creatures collapsing simultaneously. Infection vectors are terminating across the entire dispersal zone. But victory came with immediate complications that none of their models had predicted. The biological weapon proved far more virulent than expected, spreading beyond the intended containment area through wind patterns and water systems. Reports flooded in from distant settlements describing similar mass die-offs of infected populations, but also concerning accounts of plant and animal deaths that suggested broader ecological impact. "We may have just sterilized half the continent," Dr. Chen said quietly, reviewing data streams that painted an increasingly disturbing picture. "The compound is breaking down as designed, but the damage may already be irreversible." Lysander watched the aftermath unfold with the perspective of someone who had studied the rise and fall of civilizations throughout human history. "Every great empire believes its final choice is between salvation and damnation," he observed to no one in particular. "Few recognize that some victories are indistinguishable from defeat." The immediate threat was eliminated within 6 hours, leaving the sanctuary surrounded by a wasteland of dead, infected and dying ecosystem. The walls that had protected them now enclosed an island of artificial life in a sea of biological devastation that stretched to the horizon. They had achieved absolute security at the cost of becoming prisoners in their own salvation. Weeks passed as the full scope of their weapons' impact became clear. Radio communications from other survivor settlements ceased entirely, leaving them isolated in a silence that felt more ominous than the constant threat they had endured. The sanctuary's carefully maintained gardens began showing signs of contamination, while livestock sickened despite all protective measures. Zara found herself treating symptoms she couldn't identify, watching healthy people develop mysterious illnesses that defied conventional treatment. The biological weapon that had saved them was now claiming victims among the saved, its effects rippling through human and animal populations with relentless efficiency. "How long do we have?" Commander Hayes asked during a private medical consultation, her military pragmatism demanding honest assessment rather than comforting lies. "Unknown," Zara replied, studying test results that painted an increasingly grim picture. "The compound is breaking down, but it may have triggered secondary effects we didn't anticipate. Genetic damage, immune system disruption, reproductive complications, we won't know the full extent for years." The irony was not lost on anyone with the intellectual capacity to grasp it. They had defeated the infected hordes that threatened their sanctuary, only to discover that their salvation might prove just as lethal as the original crisis. Humanity's final victory was becoming humanity's final chapter, written in the same biological code that had created their enemy. Vesper approached Zara on a quiet evening when the compound's generator hummed with the artificial life support that sustained their dying paradise. "Dr. Zara, are we the bad guys now?" The question encapsulated the moral complexity of their situation with devastating simplicity. They had chosen survival over ethics, security over uncertainty, and immediate safety over long-term consequences. Whether that made them heroes or villains depended on perspectives they might never live long enough to understand. "I don't know, little star," Zara answered honestly, using Kalen's nickname for the girl who had become the moral compass of their community. "I think we're just people who made impossible choices in impossible times. History will judge whether we were right or wrong, assuming anyone survives to write that history." Outside the sanctuary walls, the world continued its transformation into something unprecedented in human experience. The infected were gone, but so was much of the natural ecosystem that had supported life for millennia. In their place, something new was emerging, not quite dead, not quite alive, but fundamentally altered by humanity's final desperate gamble. As autumn arrived with unnatural colors that reflected environmental changes beyond their comprehension, the survivors of the sanctuary faced their ultimate realization: they had not saved humanity from the infected. They had simply changed the terms of humanity's ending, trading one form of extinction for another that might prove even more final. The children still played in the compound's artificial gardens, their laughter echoing with the poignant beauty of innocence preserved in the face of absolute loss. They carried the memory of Kalen Ashworth and all the other protectors who had died believing that survival mattered more than the cost of surviving. In the end, that belief might have been humanity's greatest triumph or its most tragic mistake. Only time would tell, and time itself had become humanity's scarcest resource in a world where victory and defeat had become indistinguishable from each other. The sanctuary endured, its walls protecting the last children who would ever play games of knights and dragons, while outside those walls, the earth itself waited to see what would grow from the seeds of humanity's final choice.